I think there are, as far as I know.
Is your other writer's coming?
No.
Okay. Thanks everybody for coming out. We've got a nice audience here at bluMoon Books, and we're also webcasting this and putting it on YouTube. So if anybody wants to see a playback of this, just go to the bluMoon Books Facebook page. Lene, could you shut that door, please? And that'll provide all the links you want. I introduce myself. I'm Patrick Shepard. I'm the minority partner in this bookstore, and I'd like everyone in the very back there is Lene Orr, who's very camera shy. She's actually the person who put together this bookstore, and she's really had the vision of a small independent bookstore. It's really a good thing to have in Sacramento, and so we're really support her in that effort. Just a couple of other things. We plan on having a presentation about on a monthly basis. On April 1st, we're going to have the Sacramento baseball author Clay Sigg. He's doing a documentary about baseball players called Hometown Heroes, the single franchise baseball stars of the 20th century. And then April 8th, we have we're honoring National Poetry Month. We're going to have a local poet, Philip Loreno. I hope I got that right. And also we're going to have people doing open mics. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Steve Swat, and his co-author, Susie Swatt. Steve will be making a presentation for about 40 minutes, and then they'll both be answering questions. And we're looking at a book called Game Changers, which examines California's history through the prism of 12 elections that forever changed the state. The state. And just on a personal note, I've been part of the Capitol media gaggle with Steve for years. We've never worked directly together, but he's always been a calm and very, very, very good presence at the Capitol. So without further ado, here we go.
Thank you. I think we're getting some feedback. So it's great to be here. We always like to support our local independent bookstores, and welcome to our worldwide audience. I'm sure it's worldwide. And I should also, before we start, introduce a celebrity in the crowd, Ron Middlecoff, who was my photographer at Channel 3 for most of the 23 years I was there covering the state capitol, and he's a great photographer. The book is Game Changers, 12 Elections That Transformed California, and it really started over a dinner conversation in Seattle, 40 years inside the building. Ordinary Californians have sent powerful messages to Sacramento that reverberated under the Capitol dome and beyond, changed our lives and transformed political institutions. And so we were really glad to go around the state and talk about that. When we were writing it and researching it, it was 2014. That's when we started doing our research. 2014, if you remember, there was complete voter apathy in the state of California. Lowest turnout in history in the July primary, lowest turnout in state history in the November election. And people were telling pollsters that they didn't like politicians, they were disillusioned by government, and they felt that their votes didn't count. Well, we believe votes do count, and that elections have consequences, and that elections matter, and we wanted to tell that story. And we're trying to figure out how can we tell that story when people aren't interested to start with. And so the first thing we wanted to do was sort of connect the dots. We picked our 12 elections that we thought were transformative, and then we wanted to connect the dots in terms of how they impacted Californians 10, 20, 30, 40, or 100 years later, and draw that connection so that people living today can see how something happened in 1861 that affects their lives to this day. And that's something I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes. And then the other thing, we wanted to make this book as interesting as possible. And so through various research down at Berkeley and State Library and archives and various places, we uncovered a lot of stories and interviews, a lot of fresh interviews with former governors and assembly speakers and other people that were involved. We uncovered a lot of stories that had never been told before. And so this book is full of anecdotes, and so that was very important to us. Bruce Kane is a political scientist at Stanford, and he read the book and then wrote the foreword. But after reading the book, he said, it's sobering to realize there are so many scoundrels and psychopaths that contributed so much to California's rich political history. And so we tell the story of some of the scoundrels and psychopaths and some of the statesmen also. And I'm going to start off with talking about this one thread that I just find fascinating that started in 1861 and is still impacting us to this day. And we're starting off with an individual in California history who is revered by many, but he also was a scoundrel, and that was Leland Stanford. And Leland Stanford was elected governor of California in 1861. At the time he was elected, he not only was governor, but he was president of the Central Pacific Railroad. And he wanted to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And when he was governor, he made no attempt to separate his business life with his political life. Sort of sounds familiar, doesn't it? And one of the few things he did, it was a 2-year term, and that was it. He pushed through 7 pieces of legislation and signed them that directly put money into his pocket and into the railroad. They were subsidies, state subsidies and bond issues and things like that. Not only that, he was the leader of what's called the Big Four. Is that the screen? That's the Big Four. Those are 3 other gentlemen with him who he had met while starting, basically working with the fledgling Republican Party, which had just started in 1856. And they became fast friends, and they were all merchants, and they all sold goods to the gold miners. And so they worked together. So Stanford and his friends saw the Capitol as their personal ATM. I mentioned the 7 pieces of legislation. They also ripped off the federal government. 1862 is after he was sworn in. In 1862, in July, was the Pacific Railroad Act that was signed by President Lincoln. And what it provided for, it was a payment schedule for the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. If he and his 3 buddies could lay 1 mile of track along the flat valley, they would get paid $16,000 a mile, which was a pretty good sum back then. In the foothills, that went up to $32,000 a mile. In the Sierra Mountains, it was $48,000 a mile. The question was, however, and it wasn't laid out in the Pacific Railroad Act, where do the mountains start? Well, President Lincoln and the administration, they were busy fighting a civil war. They didn't have time to come out to California and survey the whole thing, so they let Leland Stanford and his buddies determine where the mountains started. So as Charles Crocker, one of the Big Four, later said in testimony to Congress, we took the state geologist out for a little drive. And they drove around and they asked the state geologist, well, we've got to tell the federal government where the mountains start. Where would you suggest we say that starts? And he said, well, I think the mountains start at the Sacramento River, elevation 20. And Crocker said, they're not going to buy that. Give us something a little more realistic. So he said, okay, I'll tell President Lincoln that the mountains start at Arcade Creek. Arcade Creek, 7 miles east of downtown, but the elevation is only 36 feet right then. And that's what stuck. So they ended up getting paid for a lot of work they didn't do. And that was just yet another swindle that the Big Four pulled off. Now, by the mid-1880s, the railroad was known as the Octopus. It controlled politics and commerce in the state of California. And when I say controlling politics, they owned the legislature, they owned judges, they owned sheriffs, police chiefs, city councils, even coroners. I mean, they controlled everything. They used to give free train tickets to members of the Supreme Court. They used to give free train tickets to members of the legislature for their train ride out of Sacramento to San Francisco when the session was over. As a matter of fact, the joke at the time was that you could take that train from Sacramento to San Francisco and hardly find anybody on that train who paid for a ticket. When a U.S. Senator from Nevada was made the new chair of the Pacific Railroad Committee, they gave him 50,000 acres of land in San Joaquin County. that they had accumulated because the government, federal government and other governments gave them land besides money when they were building the railroad. Now, at the same time that the railroad was becoming this octopus, a young man by the name of Hiram Johnson was enrolling at the University of California. There were 53 students in his class. He was one of those 53. And what is interesting, I attended, my wife and I both attended Cal.
Go Bears!
Go Bears. Thank you. And we also collect Cal yearbooks, believe it or not. We have like 85 of them. So I went to the yearbook while I'm doing research to find out what does it say about Hiram Johnson in there. And I found out that during his sophomore year, he was the captain of the sophomore baseball team and played right field. And for his freshman and sophomore years, he was in the Durant Rhetorical Society, which was a debating society. And then I go to see, about when he graduated, and his name's not in the yearbook. And it's not in there during when he was a junior. And I'm trying to think, what happened? Well, it took me quite a while, and I was obsessed with this, and it ended up being like one sentence in the book. But I found out that he quit school after his sophomore year to marry his pregnant girlfriend. Now, can you imagine that? I don't know whether that made news back then, but today, can you imagine, especially he was the son of a politician, today with TMZ and with Facebook and with everything else, Twitter, there would have been a huge scandal, and his political career probably would have been over before it started. He did have a bitter split with his father. His father was basically someone who carried the water for the railroad, and Hiram Johnson despised the railroad and how big it had gotten and how it was ripping off so many people in California. And there were others also. Fremont Older, who was a journalist with the San Francisco Bulletin, plus Lincoln Steffens, Ambrose Bierce. These were journalists, and they were appalled at what they saw with the railroad. The railroad tried to control public opinion by buying a lot of ads in the newspapers and then getting the newspapers to agree, don't say anything bad about me. And they would give free tickets to newspaper reporters. And Older sort of blew the whistle on them. He wrote some stories about how his colleagues in the press were up on the take. While Johnson, who had moved to San Francisco, became an assistant district attorney. And while he was prosecuting bad guys and prosecuting corruption in San Francisco, there was an anti-Southern Pacific faction that was picking up steam. Lincoln Steffens and other journalists and reformers decided to do something about the corruption, especially Southern Pacific. Steffens was part of a cadre of reform journalists at McClure's magazine, which was a big deal back then. And that infamous 1907 legislative session was considered by many historians to be the most corrupt in California history. And the reformers formulated a long list of reforms designed to drive the railroad out of California politics. And what they did is they formed what was called the Lincoln Roosevelt League, Lincoln Roosevelt Republican League. These were Republicans. The Republican Party was very dominant in California back then, but it was starting to split. You had the conservatives who liked the status quo, and they thought the railroad was fine, and a lot of them were on the take. But then you had the reformers, the progressives in the Republican Party, that wanted to kick the railroad out. So this the Lincoln Roosevelt Republican League had a platform. One is dedicated to free and honest legislators by turning the nomination of party candidates over to the people instead of having the party bosses at their conventions nominate the candidates, which is the way they used to do it. And this was a big deal because the party bosses would pick who the nominees would be. They also wanted to make it easier for ordinary Californians to influence legislative action, which I'll get to in just a second. And the 1909 legislature, after the 1908 elections, had enough of these reformers in there to get that direct election of candidates enacted. Meanwhile, there was a gentleman by the name of Boss Roof, Abraham Boss Roof, who was being targeted by San Francisco's aggressive district attorney. And remember, Hiram Johnson was working for the DA at the time. Boss Roof controlled the city hall in San Francisco through bribery and intimidation. And he controlled the mayor, who basically was a puppet. And his name was Eugene Schmitz. Roof was indicted. The DA assembled a dream team to prosecute him. And this trial was really interesting. The lead prosecutor was a gentleman by the name of Francis Haney. Hiram Johnson was on the prosecution team, but he was like second or third chair. 1 week into the trial, an ex-con walks into the courtroom, no metal detectors back then, remember, pulls out a gun, aims it point blank at Haney's face, and shoots. The bullet lodged in his jaw. He survived, but he certainly could not continue the trial. The DA then picked Hiram Johnson and said, I want you to finish the trial, which he did. And he not only finished the trial, but he got a great conviction against Boss Roof and became a household name statewide. And the reformers, they took notice. I mean, they had a platform already. They had formed their Lincoln Roosevelt Republican Club, but they needed a candidate to run in 1910, and they picked Hiram Johnson because of the fame he got in getting Boss Roof thrown in jail. So Johnson runs for governor on a singular platform, which is get the Southern Pacific out of politics. He ran as a progressive under the new rules, and the voters nominated him as the Republican candidate. Physically, he was not very imposing. He was fairly short and stout, and he wore glasses, but he was a mean son of a gun. On 2 occasions, he had decked his opposing counsel in the courtrooms. And so he was a great orator at the same time. And he was a dynamic campaigner. And again, what he had going for him was that he had the Republican nomination in a state that almost always elected Republicans. He was also from San Francisco, which was the largest city in the state at that time, and the 11th largest city in the nation. During the campaign, his greatest opponent wasn't his Democratic opponent or another opponent on the Prohibition Party label, but Harrison Gray Otis. Harrison Gray Otis was the curmudgeon publisher of the Los Angeles Times, and he was fiercely anti-union, and he hated Hiram Johnson. Why? Because Hiram Johnson briefly had worked and done some legal work for the Teamsters, and 2, he was from San Francisco, which was a union town. And so the 2 of them would go at it during this campaign. And the stories in the LA Times, if you go back and read them back then, were just awful toward Hiram Johnson. So one day, Hiram Johnson, who didn't take all the stuff sitting down, he goes to Los Angeles to give a speech during the campaign. And in the shadow of the LA Times, he delivers this address, and I'm just going to read you one little paragraph. We have nothing so vile, nothing so low, nothing so debased, nothing so infamous in San Francisco as Harrison Gray Otis. He sits there in senile dementia, with gangrene heart and rotting brain, grimacing at every reform, chattering impotently at all things that are decent, frothing, fuming, violently gibbering, going down to his grave in snarling infamy, disgraceful, depraved, corrupt, crooked, and putrescent. That is Harrison Gray Otis. Needless to say, that wasn't covered in the LA Times. His Democratic opponent, his name was Theodore Bell. He was also anti-railroad, but the Southern Pacific was more afraid of Johnson than Bell. And so the Southern Pacific not only backed Bell, but the rumor had it that they told their employees, if we find out that you're voting for Johnson, you're going to get fired. Well, that leaked, and clearly the Southern Pacific, being as arrogant as it was, that was the kiss of death for Bell. And it catapulted Hiram Johnson into the governor's office. Johnson won in a 4-way race. He received 46% of the statewide vote. And progressives took over the legislature. And it had taken only 3 years for this Lincoln Roosevelt Republican League, aided by the railroad's arrogance, to really transform the political contours of California. And what they did then, they and the legislature, affects us dramatically politically today. One of the first things they did with the new 1911 legislature is they put 23 constitutional amendments on a special election ballot. Amazing things: 8-hour workday for women, limits on child labor, workers' compensation, nonpartisan elections for judges and for local offices, regulation of the railroads, and women's suffrage. And those 3 pieces of direct democracy that are so important today, the initiative, the referendum, and the recall. Now, the initiative allows citizens to write laws themselves. They're still doing it, bypass the legislature. The referendum allows citizens to go to the polls and overturn a law that the legislature, passes and the governor signs. And the recall allows you to throw somebody out of office if you want to. The day after the election, all of these were winning except the women's suffrage. That was the only one that was going down to defeat in the newspapers on Wednesday morning. But the following day and the day after that, the rural vote started coming in from ranchers and farmers and Southern California, and it pushed the suffrage measure over the top. Barely. They only won by a couple thousand, 50.7% of the total vote, but it did win. And California became only the 6th state and the largest state so far to grant suffrage to women, allowed them to vote. And it was a big deal because after California had approved suffrage, the number of women in the United States who could vote doubled overnight. And it was really an impetus for other larger states to go forward and give women the vote. Despite the importance of those 23 measures, and those were absolutely critical measures, perhaps the most transformative election in California history, voter turnout was slight. It was not really great. And the New York Times sort of had it figured out when they said, well, the ballot's too complicated. There's too much homework that people have to do. They're going to become tired and puzzled and muddled going through this entire ballot. And that's sort of what happened, and it still to this day sort of happens. So in 1912, 3 initiatives were put on the ballot, including one to close down bookmaking in California, but all 3 lost. In 1914, 17 measures qualified for the ballot, and 5 of them were approved, including the abolition of the poll tax. In other words, you had to pay if you wanted to vote back then, and they got rid of that. And obviously that prevented a lot of poor Californians from voting, right? So in 1914, Hiram Johnson sought re-election, and he said, it used to be that the Southern Pacific regulates the state. Now the state regulates Southern Pacific. He also said graft and corruption have been eliminated from California. No, he was a little premature with that. I think we know. So what's the legacy of the progressive era? It's an amazing legacy, and Hiram Johnson's election. The primary goal, if the primary goal was to rid the state of the insidious Southern Pacific dominance, that it did, and it worked. If the goal was to give ordinary citizens more clout and greater ability to influence public policy, that worked also. For example, the referendum. We've seen the referendum work several times since then. 1982, most famously, Californians said no to the peripheral canal that had passed the legislature, and Governor Brown, the first Governor Jerry Brown, had signed. And that would have taken water out of the Sacramento River and sent it down south. And voters said no. So that went by the wayside. There was a very significant vote in 1964 where Californians voted against the Rumford Fair Housing law because they didn't want that. They thought it would hurt real estate values and so on. That was overturned. And then most recently in the last election, the plastic bag ban, the bag industry, the plastics industry, qualified a referendum to overturn that, but voters said no. As for the recall, it has not been used extensively. Most recently in the legislature was in the 1990s, where you had Doris Allen. Is she up there? Doris Allen was the Assembly Speaker, but she and Paul Horcher was another Republican. Both of them were Republican assemblymen, but they were accused of being too cozy with Willie Brown, who was the Assembly Speaker back then, and so they were voted out of office by their constituents in the district. And only 2 others have been recalled in the last 100 years. And then you've got the recall of 2003 when Gray Davis was recalled from office. He did not cause the dot-com crash, but he made the budget situation worse. He did not cause the energy crisis. Primarily that was Enron and some other energy companies gaming the system, but he made the energy crisis worse through his indecision. And he was considered really kind of bland and boring, and so all of a sudden, voila, who shows up? Arnold Schwarzenegger to run against him, and Schwarzenegger, wins the governorship. I will say that when you recall someone from office, you have to be careful what you wish for, because what's so interesting is that Arnold Schwarzenegger left office with a 23% approval rating, which equaled Gray Davis's low approval rating. Also, he saddled the next governor, Jerry Brown, with a $25 billion budget deficit, which means he couldn't solve the budget crisis either. And only 12% of Californians at that time thought that the state was moving in the right direction. So you can get rid of a governor, for various reasons, but not sometimes the next one doesn't necessarily work out either. As for the initiative, that is heavily used. And Howard Jarvis really, in 1978, with Proposition 13, the property tax cut, that was a watershed year, not only for public policy and the fact that this measure sucked, $5 or $6 billion out of the property taxes, and those are the dollars that went to education. And so the state had to scramble to find other pots of money and other taxes to fund education. But because this was such a popular measure, and this was the tax revolt that started a wave throughout the entire country, it emboldened so many other individuals and companies and organizations to go the initiative route and to bypass the governor and bypass the legislature to enact their own laws. And if you just count up just a handful of some of the important issues that have been solved by the voters and not by the legislature and not by the governor, dealing with the environment, the Coastal Protection Act, crime, punishment, school funding, mental health funding, income taxes, property taxes, transportation taxes, tobacco taxes, term limits, insurance regulation, after-school activities, marijuana legalization, campaign finance. It goes on and on. These are all subjects that the legislature either couldn't or wouldn't handle, and the voters took it on themselves to take care of it. Now, critics have suggested that special interests have hijacked the system because it takes maybe $3, $4, $5 million sometimes to get a measure qualified on the ballot, and only some well-heeled organizations have that kind of money. So that is one of the criticisms. And some of the measures can be pretty frivolous. In the last election, someone tried to qualify a measure that would outlaw eating shellfish. What? It didn't qualify, but that was kind of weird. Another one had a measure that would change the name of the governor of California to President of California. Okay. There was another measure a couple of years ago that would have outlawed divorce. And I figured the guy probably got taken to the cleaners in his divorce, and he was trying to qualify a measure. In the last November, 14 measures were on the ballot. Most of them passed: higher tobacco taxes, income taxes, marijuana legalization, school bonds, background checks if you purchase ammunition, streamlining the appeal process in death penalty cases. So significant public policy issues are being decided by the voters. In all, as a matter of fact, a record $485 million were spent on this last election, and $111 million in one chunk came from the pharmaceutical industry, which was fighting and was successful, fighting against a measure that would have lowered drug prices in state-run programs. So let's go back to what I call the ripple effect. I remember we talked about the cause and effect. How an event in 1861 can affect us to this day. It's like dropping a pebble into a pond and you watch the ripples radiate. So that from 1861 through the Progressives and Hiram Johnson today, that's sort of one ripple effect. But there's another aspect of this also, because while the legislators and the governor back in 1910 or 11 and 12 kicked the Southern Pacific lobbyists out of the Capitol, they did not make any other laws dealing with lobbyists. And that has taken on a life of its own. And so what we have today in terms of lobbyist influence, that can be traced all the way back to 1910 as well. And I'm going to talk about that in the next few minutes, and then I'll be glad to answer any questions if you have some. When the lobbyists were kicked out of the SP lobbyists were kicked out, there was a vacuum. And filling that vacuum or that void was a lobbyist by the name of Artie Samish. I don't know if any of you heard of him, but he was one of the most colorful political figures in the state of California in our history. He came out of San Francisco. He was 300 pounds. He was a seventh grade dropout, and he dominated the legislature in the 20s, 30s, and the 40s. He cornered the market on lobbying influence, representing the biggest, wealthiest interests: racetracks, alcohol, chemical companies, transportation, and the banks. I mean, he had it all. He had offices in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, and at the Senator Hotel when the legislature was in session here in Sacramento. He held court at the Senator Hotel. Lawmakers would come to him, and basically he would tell them how to vote. He had a cadre of informants and operators that he called My Gestapo. He threw lavish parties for legislators. He had an open bar 24 hours a day, food 24 hours a day. All they had to do is walk over to the Senator Hotel and get it. He said he knew if a lawmaker wanted a baked potato, a girl, or a potato, or money. Excuse me. His motto was select and elect. He would select those people that he wanted to be legislators, and he would make sure that they would actually get elected. And let me give you an example. In 1934, there was an assemblyman in Los Angeles by the name of Claire Woolwine. He had been re-elected and then re-elected 2 other times. Huge margins. I mean, very popular down in his district. But he was voting against one of his clients, and his client didn't like that. So they asked Samish, what can you do about it? So in 1934, this is in the middle of the Depression, right? And Upton Sinclair, who was running for governor, and he had a campaign headquarters in Los Angeles, and so one of his Gestapo walked into the headquarters and and he notices there are a whole bunch of down-and-out Skid Row denizens stuffing envelopes. And he asked somebody, raise your hand if you know you're from the 41st Assembly District or whatever it was. And one guy raises his hand. And he lived in a flop house. His only income was $12 a month in federal relief. And they snatched him. They cleaned him up, fixed his teeth, bought him 2 suits, printed 100,000 little postcards, and ran him for the state assembly against this Claire Woolwine. And guess what? He won. And then he was reelected 5 times after that. His name was John Pelletier. From Los Angeles, and that's how he got his career. Here's another example, my favorite example, I guess, of how Samish would operate. One of his clients was Shenley Industries, distillers of liquor, right? And they made a bourbon. And the bourbon could not compete with a competitive bourbon made by Hiram Walker, which was called 10 High. And 10 High had almost cornered the market in California. So they went to Artie Samish, what can you do about this? So Samish does a little research and finds out that 10 High is aged 3 years. So he gets one of his buddies in the legislature to introduce a bill that says you cannot sell bourbon in California unless it's aged 4 years. They pass the bill. The governor vetoes it. It goes back to the legislature. They override the veto with a 2/3 vote. And that's how 10 High got put out of business in the state of California. It's just amazing. Just the brazen arrogance, but he got things done. Now, in 1949, Samish told his story to Collier's Magazine, which was a big magazine back then, and he boasted that he was more powerful than the governor, and he posed as a puppeteer who controlled the legislature. He thought that was kind of cute, right? Well, and in that article, Governor Earl Warren was quoted as saying, well, on matters that affect his clients, Artie Samish is more important than the governor and has more influence and power than the governor. Well, you can guess what hit the fan after that. I mean, the governor was embarrassed. The legislature was embarrassed. Everybody was embarrassed. So the first thing they did was they exiled Artie Samish from the Capitol. And eventually Samish went to federal prison for income tax evasion. But even with Samish gone, there has little changed at the Capitol because lobbyists continue to have a lot of influence, and they continue to spend freely on lawmakers. John Burton, who was the president pro tem of the Senate, and he started his political career back in the early 60s, and so he remembers this. And he did, in an interview for our book, he said that the lobbyist-legislator culture or relationship was an important informal custom. He said that lobbyists would write cashier's checks to legislators and just give it to them during campaign season. And they could either use it for the campaign or they could pocket the money. And it wasn't illegal. And that happened all the time. He even said that he was stunned to see some staffers at the Capitol get new suits bought by lobbyists. And so it was like the Wild West in the legislature. So it was only a matter of time before an ambitious politician would seize on the freewheeling legislator lobbyist culture as a potent campaign issue. And that would have been Jerry Brown the Younger, right? 1.0. That politician, of course, was Jerry Brown. He rode the reform issue to the governorship in 1974, thanks in large part to A, his name, and B, Watergate. As a matter of fact, speaking of his name, I did an interview with Pat Brown, his father, once, and he told me quite candidly, he said, I'm not being big-headed or fat-headed to say that the only reason he won is because of my name, and which is probably true. But Watergate certainly helped him because at that time he was pushing what was then the Proposition 9, which was the Political Reform Act. So everything sort of, the stars aligned for Jerry Brown. And the Political Reform Act was approved by 70% of the voters because they were getting sick and tired of all this lobbyist mess, right? And that Political Reform Act became the model for the nation. Prior to Proposition 9, the Political Reform Act, lobbyists used to eat together, they used to play together, used to make public policy together. And these were like white male lobbyists who would do all of that. Proposition 9 prohibited lobbyists from spending more than $10 a month entertaining a member of the legislature. It also required all state and local candidates to file campaign reports listing their contributions in plain English, so actually voters could see all of that. Before, they had to list their contributions, but they wouldn't report them until after the election. What good is that, right? So this sort of really changed the system, and as I mentioned, became a model for the nation. So voters could know exactly which special interests were funding which candidates, and sort of figure out, by reading those reports, how to vote. So lobbyists today, though, still play a key role, even though things have changed. They can't pay direct contributions to candidates, but they can sort of direct them, tell their clients who to pay for. But at least we know where that money is coming from, and we know it in a timely fashion before the election. And there is an obscene amount of money, without a doubt, in the legislative process. In 1998, now that's 20 years ago just about, $500 million were spent on statewide elections. I mean, can you imagine how many teachers we could hire with $500 million? It's unbelievable. 2 years later, 2000, California voters approved a contribution limit. So they basically said you can't make direct contributions over a certain threshold to these candidates. The problem is there's a sort of a loophole there. You can go around and do what's called independent expenditures, set up a separate committee, and that committee can then pay, finance whatever it wants with a candidate. And the problem is the courts have sanctioned that. The courts have said contribution limits are okay because we don't want to corrupt an individual candidate. But independent expenditures can be unlimited because you cannot corrupt an idea, although they didn't take into effect, I think, that you can corrupt an election. But that wasn't part of their thinking. So California's political history really is full of scoundrels and sociopaths and some statesmen. And our book really has lots of these stories on Pat Brown and on term limits and on Howard Jarvis and Proposition 13 and Jesse Unruh, the first major assembly speaker, and why we have a full-time legislature instead of the old part-time legislature. And also we have a chapter on the dirtiest campaign in California history. And I'll just give you a hint. It wasn't recently. It was 1934. But you have to read the book to find out. So that's my presentation. I'll be glad to take any questions if anybody has some.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure. Yes, believe it or not. Believe it or not. Corruption was rampant. Payoffs, bribery, intimidation. When Southern Pacific, I told you, when Southern Pacific was running the show, they ran the legislature. Abe Roof, for example, would walk onto the floor of the assembly, whisper into assembly member's ear or a senator's ear, and a lobbyist for the Southern Pacific would do the same thing right before a vote. And then the vote shows up. Well, you can't do that anymore, right? You can't have these under-the-table payoffs, or if you do, you get caught, and sometimes people get caught. But yeah, it was a lot worse back then.
So now you were a reporter when Gray Davis was taken out of office, right?
No, I was a reporter when Gray Davis, in 1975, when Jerry Brown started, Gray Davis was his chief of staff, and so I was a reporter then. And then when Gray Davis left and ran for the state assembly, I was a reporter then. By 2003, I had become a public affairs consultant.
Okay, but that crisis was nowhere as serious as, because we all thought that was a pretty big deal, losing our governor. But
It's kind of a big deal losing our governor, but we don't devote. It's not one of our transformational elections because we write a half a chapter about it or a quarter of a chapter about it because we didn't really know. We don't know if that's going to change, and we thought maybe at the time that could sort of cause upheaval, and we'd want to throw out every governor that we don't like. Hasn't happened yet, so the jury is still out, but it's not really transformational. Same time, we devote some space to Ronald Reagan. But that he doesn't have, and we have some really interesting stories about him. But he doesn't have a chapter to himself because that election in 1966 wasn't transformational, and that was the key to this book. It had to have been made a really significant impact moving forward. And sure, Reagan had his impact, but he was president when he had his impact. His impact as governor was kind of negligible. And what is interesting is that he was asked if he had any regrets. This is after he had left, and he said, I only have a couple of regrets. One, he signed the Therapeutic Abortion Act, liberalizing abortion in California, and he said, I never should have done that, and he took a lot of heat for that. Two, he signed a no-fault insurance measure, and he regretted that. And three, he supported creation of the full-time legislature in 1966. And afterwards, he says, we should stay part-time. He regretted that. Those are the only three.
But we did include the 1966 election in the part that it created the full-time legislature and really changed the whole state in terms of legislating, full-time legislators with lobbyists. It changed everything in terms of legislating.
Right. This is Susie, by the way, and she's my co-author. And she can answer questions better than I can, probably. Yes.
Given your vast knowledge of California, kind of a hypothetical, you mentioned how traditionally over the years Republicans had the governorship quite commonly in California.
And the legislature.
Now we're in a quite different situation.
Yeah.
Where essentially what could be perceived as a repudiation of Barack Obama's 8 years led the Republicans being in control of Congress, the presidency, the vast majority of governorships, the vast majority of state legislatures, et cetera, which I'm not unhappy about. Spoiler alert. Can you see in an environment now where the response in California is at least on some level to withdraw and secede from the nation because of the feeling of a lot of people? Can you see a Republican being elected governor again, say in my daughter's?
Yeah. That's really interesting because we do devote a part of a chapter to that question. And we talked to some Republican experts about that. And in terms of context, California hasn't supported a Republican presidential candidate since 1988. We haven't had a single Republican.
Bush Sr., right?
It was Bush Sr. Yes. We haven't had a single statewide officer as a Republican in 10 years. Right? Schwarzenegger. Right? Okay. And a lot of people believe the genesis of the problem, and this is one of the problems, and a lot of Republicans do, was with when Pete Wilson really pushed hard on Proposition 187 in 1994, which it's an issue of dealing with undocumented immigrants, still an issue today. That measure would have denied all public social funding for anybody who's undocumented, including health care. And it passed, actually. It passed, and it helped Pete Wilson get reelected in 1994. But in talking to people we know who are Republican consultants, they said what that did was, first of all, it planted a lot heavily seeds in the minds of minorities that you don't want us here. Following that 1994 measure, there was another measure on bilingual education and another measure on affirmative action, both also pushed by Republicans, that continue to reinforce the idea that they don't want us here. And at the same time, you had so much growth among Latinos, primarily in the state of California, so that now California is majority minority. And that, it's been, 20 some odd years, and those opinions are pretty hard and fast. Now, getting to your question, there's a consultant by the name of Richard Temple. He's done political consulting for Republican candidates for probably 30 years, right? 30 years. And we asked him this question. He says, if you ask Latinos, for example, what are their major issues? It's, a lot of it is jobs, it's family, faith, and things like that. On the natural, they should be Republicans. But because of these other issues that sort of snuck in, they're not, generally. He thinks that, over time, if you can sort of get the right messages to enough people, that there can be a Republican comeback. Right now, though, it looks really, bleak for Republicans. Only 27% of the registered voters in California are Republicans. And, there are many who believe that you'll have an independent elected governor of California before you'll have a Republican. And a lot of it, it's probably getting, what you cited in the national trend, it's not helping in California. Because, Trump and the Republican legislature, the immigration's a big issue. Well, minorities are growing, and foreign-born immigrants are growing in California, and so those are sort of tugging against each other. So, in your daughter's lifetime, yeah, probably, but it's going to take a while. And they can. California won't secede. First of all, to secede, you have to jump through so many hoops. Not only do Californians have to want to secede, but the federal government has to let us secede. And to do that, it would take the Congress, House of Representatives, and the Senate, and I think probably it'd have to be a constitutional amendment, wouldn't it? Which would take 3/4 of the legislatures. And although a lot of the Republicans might say, "Hey, bye-bye, go ahead," they don't want to lose all the money. We pay more money than we get out in terms of the feds, and so they wouldn't let us go.
Thank you. That's a great answer.
All right, sure. It was a long answer, but I'm sorry. I will also tell you. There was one assembly in the 1920s where out of the 80 members, 77 were Republicans. That's how dominant the Republicans were in the 1920s, and they were nationally too. You had Roosevelt, but then you had Taft and Coolidge and things like that. Herbert Hoover, that's when things started to turn around. How about our students from Oak Ridge? Yes.
Well, I have one question. Like, if you have that
Sandwich, yes.
sandwich,
Artie Sandwich.
serving sandwiches there at the hotel, but is there less corruption, or is it more underground, or more hidden, or is it being exerted in different ways, just not as open?
I wouldn't say it's corruption. There are occasions. There have been a few, and fairly recently, a couple of senators have gotten into trouble and things like that. So it's still there, but it was worse then. It really was. The money would flow freely, and we had no idea, who was giving it to whom. Susie, you want to do that? Susie.
All of those today,
Oh yeah, sure.
today, all of these campaign contributions are reportable. Steve and I, when we were doing research for the book, we were really interested in how we'd look at old campaign reports. They're all in the archives at the Secretary of State's office. And the reports, as Steve mentioned, they weren't filed until after the election.
Tell me about Miriam.
Oh, why don't you found that one. That
well,
was a good one.
Frank Merriam was running for governor. He was lieutenant governor, and he was running for governor in 1934. And he was running against Upton Sinclair, who was a socialist, muckraking journalist, but he was a socialist, but he switched parties to become a Democrat so he could get the nomination and run. The business community and the Republican community, conservative community, were apoplectic that Upton Sinclair might actually win. Upton Sinclair wanted to nationalize every business he could find. And so you had, the Hollywood industry, you had everybody. They put together maybe up to $10 million, and they created or hired the nation's very first political consulting firm, which is why we devoted a chapter to it, to basically smear Upton Sinclair, and they acknowledge it, and make sure he doesn't win. And so we're going through the papers at the Secretary of State or State Archives, and we're looking at all the campaign funds. And Merriam writes down, how much money did you spend in this campaign? He writes down 0. And he says, I didn't spend any money. I just, maybe traveled a little bit or something like that. Well, $10 million were spent against him. And these were basically the forerunner of independent expenditures, sort of backdoor payments, but they never got written down anywhere. There was no accounting. Nobody knew. I'll just give you another example while I've got you here, because this is a great example. Louis B. Mayer of MGM, he was the head of the Republican Central Committee, and he was one of the apoplectic Republicans who really afraid of Upton Sinclair. So what he did, a few weekends back then, in the movie houses, they had newsreels. They didn't have TV back then, but they had newsreels. And so they would have like news stories in the newsreels. He had actors at MGM portray Russians and foreign-born bums and hobos coming into California on freight trains, and then telling the cameraman, saying, oh yeah, all my friends, we're all coming to California because once Upton Sinclair is elected, he's going to give us each $1,000. It was all made up. It was totally phony. But these things ran the 3 weeks before the election, and it may have tipped the balance because Sinclair lost by, I'm trying to think, 300,000 votes, I think.
And I'll just tell you another story in terms of the difference with reports. I remember I left the legislature and worked at the Fair Political Practices Commission, and I always liked to look at people's campaign reports because it told you a lot of what was going on. And there was one legislator, her name was Carol Migden. She was from San Francisco. And her campaign reports, I looked at them, they didn't jive. I couldn't figure it out. I could always understand reports, understand money, how much was spent, how much came in, and what was kind of left over. She did not compute from year to year. And you're supposed to carry over. If you have cash on hand, you need to carry it over. And she wasn't carrying over any cash on hand. I'd look at her at the end of her previous year's report, and at one time she had $350,000 cash on hand. But she started the next year's report with 0 cash on hand. Eventually, I brought this to attention of certain people at the FPPC, the enforcement division. Eventually, her reports were gone over with a fine-tooth comb, and she was fined $360,000. You cannot do these things today like you used to be able to, like Steve mentioned with Frank Merriam in 1934 when he was running for governor. His report said he did not receive any contributions. We actually got a picture of it, took a Xerox of it, because here's somebody who was running for governor of the state and said he did not receive any contributions whatsoever.
But there were no laws
Right.
that said you couldn't do that. So is there corruption today? Yeah, there is some, no doubt about it, but it's not nearly as bad.
That's good to know.
Yeah. And you have a lot of laws in the book. And I will say, and I know legislators get a bad rap, but there are a lot of really good ones out there, and they try hard, and there's some bad ones, but a lot of good ones.
The good outweigh the bad.
Yeah,
She's saying no.
One further question, and then I think people can mingle. We said we go about an hour. What are you guys working on now?
Oh, we're working on a new book.
A new
and maybe we'll be back here in a year. It traces the women's struggle for political equality in California from the gold rush to today. So it goes through getting the right to vote, suffrage, becoming lawyers, and we found, whatever it is, it goes on and on. We in our research, and we're just a couple chapters into it, it's really interesting. We're meeting and reading about people who we've never heard of. And we're pretty well read on California history. Never heard of them. They've done some fantastic things. Do we have 1 minute to tell a story? I'll tell one story. There's a woman by the name of Clara Foltz. Clara Foltz was born in Indiana. And when she was 15 years old, during the Civil War, she eloped with a soldier. And she immediately started having babies. She had 5 kids. She gets to California with her husband and 5 little kids, 9 years old and younger. And he takes off, goes to Portland with a girlfriend, and leaves her stranded. Now she's like 30 years old or something, or in her 20s. She wants to be a lawyer because her father was a lawyer. But California law says only white males can be lawyers. So the only job she can get to support her family is sewing and making hats, and that was a woman's work back then. So she decides to do something about it. So she goes to a state senator in San Jose, which is where she was living, and gets the senator to introduce a bill saying, basically, anybody, you can be, if you're anybody in good standing, you can be a lawyer. You don't have to be a white male. And basically took out the word male out of the law. And so the bill somehow passes the legislature, and it's sitting on the governor's desk. And the governor had a deadline to sign the bill or veto the bill, and nobody knew what the governor was going to do. The deadline was midnight this one evening. So outside the governor's office that evening, everybody, all the lobbyists and everybody else, they're waiting to hear about what's going to happen. 15 minutes before midnight, some guy runs out of the governor's office and says, "The lady lawyer's bill is dead." And Clara Foltz gets really angry. She bursts past a guard into the governor's office, gets into the governor's inner office where he's signing the last batch of bills with the attorney general and some aides. And everybody says, "What are you doing here?" "I'm here because I'm concerned about the lady lawyer's bill." And the governor looks up at her and says, looks up at the aide and says, "Where is that bill?" The aide says, "It's over here in the stack to be vetoed." But he hadn't vetoed it yet. So they fish it out of the pile. He looks at it, looks at Clara Foltz and says, "This is a good bill, I'm going to sign it." Right then. And then the clock struck 12 as she told the story. That's just one story. Our books are very anecdotal, a lot of stories, because we want to make politics interesting for people who don't like politics. So there's a lot of storytelling. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. And I hope our students get a good score in your AP history class. Yeah. and they actually stayed for the whole presentation, which is something, I tell you. Oh, I will tell